Now this is basically it for handling forms. Let's move on to validation now. So with validation, the idea basically here is whenever you type something, of course, if it's gibberish and I click on reset, you see that the logic is going to break here. We get nans. This is because I didn't type an actual value, an actual valid date. And when we call the moment wrapper or moment function on it, it was not able to convert that string to an actual date. So we need to provide some kind of validation here. Let's add a new property on the state. And this property is going to be called valid. By default, we're going to say that it's true. Now, here we have the event object, but of course we can also use destructuring. So we don't actually need the whole event object, and we don't actually need the target sub-object of that event object. We can actually destructure it. So we need to get access to the target, okay? But specifically, we need to extract the value from that target. So I'm going to use deep destructuring here. This will basically allow us to access the value from that object. Whenever I use the two curly braces, we are going to end up, the variable that we end up in the end is actually value. So we don't care about the target, just give me the value. And let's do console log of that value. And we're going to set that value on the date. Okay, let's save that. Let's type something out. And as you can see here, it updates the state. The value that we get is basically going to be the value of the target on the event object. So just a bit of destructuring for you there. Next. So here basically we want to validate the value that you typed. So we want to also update the valid property. Now the one thing we could do is, let's say we were to add constant date, and we're going to just wrap it into the moment call, and this is going to convert the value to a moment object. And of course that will not necessarily be valid, but that's why we have the valid property. So we're going to call a few methods here. So we could do date is valid. When you call that method on the moment object, it's going to give you either true or false. It's going to be true if it's actually a proper date. Let's save it and let's actually check in the browser. So I'm going to open the React DevTools. Let's go to the input. So we have the input here, we have the date picker. It's valid by default. So the valid property on the state is true. If I type gibberish, it's going to be false. But if I type something valid, let's say 2018, that's a valid date. For moment actually recognizes that string as a valid date. It's able to convert that date to an actual moment object. That's why we get value set to true. Okay. Now here basically the idea is we do not want to call that method. So we do not want to update the value of the next state on the state. We don't actually want to invoke this method if the value of the date is invalid, and that's why we have the valid property here on the state. Okay, so what we could do is here we could say if this state valid is not true, so let's negate it, or actually let's actually say if it's valid, then you want to call that method. Okay, else let's just do console log invalid, just to make this clear for this concept. And let's actually save it and let's go back. So if I type gibberish, and let's click on reset. Okay, it's going to give us invalid. If we do, let's say 2019, you click on reset and it updates the values here, but let's do something different. Let's do let's say 2020 05 12, for example. As you can see, this is a valid date, and that's why it updates the timer. And the one thing I notice here is we still have the title of new year. Let's actually go back and update it for a second here. Let's actually do this. So because we have the next date on the state, let's destructure it also. Let's get its value here in the render method. Let's actually replace new year with that value. Now, of course, this is an object. If you save it like that, it's going to fail. It can't, it can't call toString on this object, and you need to be explicit. So you need to call either toString yourself, or there's also toLocale string on that date object, on that moment object. This is going to give us some value like this one. Of course, it's not readable for humans. It's not very flexible. One thing you could do is if you were to go to moment documentation, so let's do moment.js. We're going to go to the docs, and if you search for calendar, there is a special method that allows you to get the calendar time on any moment instance. So for example, we have a moment here. This is basically an instance of the moment object, right? Whenever you call calendar on it, you could either pass a reference time, but if you don't pass it, it's going to default to the value of now, to the date of now. And then it's going to give you a formatted string that looks something like this. So for example, last Monday at 2:30 a.m. or 7/10/2011. So it's going to convert that moment instance, that date, and it's going to give you a calendar value. So something that's readable for humans. And this is exactly what we want. So if I were to call calendar on that next date object, I'm going to get something that looks like this. Okay, so this is January 1st of 2019. So this is new year. But if I were to type, let's say 2019, May 31st, and I click on reset, it's going to give me that value. But as you can see here, it's quite flexible. So if I tried something like, let's say tomorrow, this would be 2018. Okay, the 1st January, let's do 21st. Let's do 12:15 p.m. Okay, so noon is going to give me tomorrow at that time. So it's, as you can see, it's pretty flexible. Let's go back to the date picker. I'm going to remove the else condition. The other trick I'll do here, first of all, we are already accessing properties on the state twice. So I'm actually going to destructure them with this destructuring syntax here. So I'm going to have the valid property, and I'm also going to have a date. And we're going to extract them from the state. So again, this is just ES6 syntax. If you're not sure how this works, just go back to the ES6 series. I've done a bunch of tutorials on that. Just go back and review those videos if you're not comfortable using that syntax. But what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to do the following. Let's do valid, and if it's valid, we're going to call that method. And of course, let's remove the state reference there because we already have the date. How does this syntax work? Okay, so this has nothing to do necessarily with React or ES6 or anything of that nature. This is actually a feature that's been in JavaScript forever, okay? So the way this works is you have an expression here. We have a logical comparison. So I'm saying if valid is a variable, and again, it's being extracted from the state. So if this is true, okay, if this is true, we want to execute this function or expression, or it could be anything. It could be a value, it could be a Boolean, or it could be, in this case, it could be false. If it's false, then the whole expression would be false. But it could also be, let's say, an assignment, a variable assignment, or it could be an expression, or it could be a function call. In this case, we want to call onDateReset. This function will only fire if valid is true. So if I were to say false by default, this will always be false, and the function onDateReset will never execute. If I say true, it will always execute. Okay? But in this case, we want to rely on the value of valid. If it's valid, execute the function. Otherwise, don't execute it. This will be false, and the second argument will be disregarded because this is how logical operations work. If the first argument is, let's say, false, and the logical operator is and, you're not going to look at the second one because the condition would anyways be false because the first one is false. But if the first one is true, you're going to look at the second one. Now in this case, it's actually going to execute the second one because it's a function call. So I hope that makes sense. And if you're not sure about this syntax, it's actually it's used quite often in React. So you could just, either look it up, look up the and logical operator, just Google it, and you'll see a bunch of different references on how to use this. Like I said, this has nothing to do with React or ES6, it's just a feature in JavaScript. So this was just a bit of a side note for you, and I hope that makes sense. If we save it, just to prove you that this actually works, let's do the date of, again, tomorrow. I'm not being very creative here, but let's do 12 p.m. We click on reset. It's a valid date, so the form gets submitted and we actually update the state. But if I type gibberish, I click reset, before we would get an error, right? We would get an error in the console, and also we would get NaN values in the timer. Everything would break. But for now, because we have validation in place, when I click reset, we don't get any problems. It actually doesn't crash the app because that method never gets called, okay? Because the valid is false. Now, the other condition I also want to add is we want to check that the date is actually something in the future. Because if I were to type, let's say, something in the past, let's say 2018, 2016, or 101, we get negative values. And that's not cool because, and of course, as you can see, it actually increments. So it's completely broken. It's not, this needs to be actually fixed. So we need to make sure that the date that you enter is also a date in the future. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to calculate the difference. The difference only makes sense whenever you have a date that's in the future. So I'm going to add another condition here. We're going to call is after, I believe. Actually, let's check the docs because off the top of my head, I can't actually recall. Yeah, I think it's called is after. And you call that on any moment instance, and then you pass another instance to it. In this case, I would just pass moment. So again, what this is going to do is we have a date, we have an actual moment instance because we call the moment constructor or function. When you call is after, it's going to check that that instance, that date is actually after given another date. In this case, we're passing another moment instance. And like I said before, it's going to default to the present date, the current date, because you're not passing anything to the constructor as an argument. So it's going to be the date of now. Okay. You could also pass new date, by the way. This is also going to work. I'm just going to stick to moment just for consistency, but again, nothing wrong with it. You could pass new date. You could use a built-in date object in JavaScript as well. Okay, and let's save that. If I go back to the app, if I were to type something in the past, and again, if I were to click reset, as you can see, because it's not valid, the form gets submitted, but we're not calling the method on the parent component, right? So it's not actually updating the state of the parent component. If I type something in the future, this is a valid date, and it's going to be updated. Again, let's do maybe June, reset, the date gets reset, okay? And just like before, everything else is also functional. If you were to click pause, it's going to pause the timer. If you resume, it's going to resume the timer. It's going to recalculate the difference again and re-render the timer, update all the values. Everything is going to be working just fine, just like before. So all the functionality is the same otherwise.